Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome to Exiger Nexus. This will be a series of discussions where we talk about the latest news, topics, issues that our clients care about, where there's a nexus of economic and national security. And then in these Nexus sessions, we'll be speaking with our experts from industry and government on the topics they've been tracking. So we've got Carrie Wibben, Brandon Daniels, and Matt Hayden. And with that, Brandon, do you want to kick us off? It's been, I don't know, kind of a low-key week, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I wish we had chosen a better week to kick this off, because this week has just been so darn uneventful. Quite literally the largest critical infrastructure hack in our history happened this week. And, besides that, it was all roses. But I guess just to kick us off, I think where we're going to spend our time in the next however many sessions there are, and if y'all like the sessions, then we'll do more, is we're going to be talking about where our work really lives, which is at the intersection of industry and government, and at the intersection of economic and national security. And what we're going to do every single week is just give our thoughts, our advice, our guidance, our high-level analysis of critical things that are happening in our markets. And we hope that they're informative, and we hope that they help to spark conversation, because right now, conversation is critical. We're living in a time where the pace of change has outstripped almost everyone's years or decades or multiple decades of experience. And we're kind of living on a new cutting edge of security management and of risk management. But to that point, I mean, why don't we kick off with the news of the week? The most interesting issue to me this week was obviously the Colonial Pipeline attack, right? The ransomware attack. I mean, what was so interesting to me about this is it shows how fragile our supply chains truly are, right? I saw a lot in the news where people were saying things like, why don't we have a second pipeline? Or are there, redundancy measures that we should be taking in order to make sure that these kinds of attacks can't disrupt major parts of our infrastructure? And the thinking that I had back to that was, that would be at the cost of the taxpayer. It would be at the cost of, lots of other programs. In COVID, our key issue was making sure that people could eat. People weren't getting sick, right? So how do you, when you have so many priorities and so many critical priorities, how do you prioritize infrastructure appropriately? And I think that's something that the Biden administration is really tackling right now, right? They're sort of prioritizing and analyzing the right ways to incentivize infrastructure. And so when I see this Colonial Pipeline hack, I don't immediately think, oh my gosh, how do we protect our infrastructure from cyber attacks alone? I think, how do we diversify our infrastructure more effectively? How do we create redundancy in our supply chains? How do we avoid these kind of core supply issues from impacting our national defense strategy, from impacting our civilian essential industries and critical infrastructure, right? How do we create a world where we have insight into these kinds of single points of failure and that we can proactively address them? But also, to talk about the really cool thing about this is that this is one of the most pervasive hacks in our history, and it highlights for us and brings to attention the issues that we have in terms of securing our information technology infrastructure. So for me, this was the perfect storm. And what is that old adage? You don't want to waste a crisis, right? Or there's opportunity in crisis or something like that. this is one of those instances where I think we have an awesome opportunity. What'd you say?
Don't let a good crisis go to waste.
That's the right one. Yeah, that's right. I think that this is one of those moments that we have to say, don't let a good crisis go to waste. Let's do what the Biden administration was determined to do at the beginning of this year, which is secure our supply chains, eliminate redundancy in them, eliminate adversarial threats, and then also what bookended this week, implement strong and secure cyber risk management at every level of our supply chain, right? And I think that's what this means to us more than the few days struggling at the pump.
And the other upside, which you failed to mention, is that my family and friends now sort of have a sense of the type of work we do. I don't know if you're having that experience too, but in the past year, I mean, there's just been a lot more mainstream focus on these really important topics that are probably underpinning everything that we know and take for granted. That's
right. Yeah.
So Matt, kind of pivoting off of, well, I want to stay on that topic for a second because everybody has sort of a unique angle. Matt, I saw you chiming in here. I'm going to put myself on mute.
Yeah. So the way that in DHS speak, national critical functions, they sat down and tried to lay out what are the functions that are necessary for the United States to operate as it does today, and where do we have to build in a lot of resiliency and really harden those facilities for physical, all sorts of things, supply chain and the like. And of those 55, they got into subsectors and broke it all down. What you would find under things like fuel delivery was that it was a nexus for several other dependent features. So you had, if you can't get gas, you can't do deliveries, you can't go to grocery stores, to trucking, all of that. And so starting from there, you had a full interagency group to try and work with all the sectors to say, okay, we understand that there are 16 sectors of critical infrastructure and everybody wants to say that their sector is more critical than the next. But what they tried to say is, all right, where are these intersections? And let's buffer those. Let's make sure that if there are pinch points that need not extra attention, but just are single points of failure, or at least difficult to harden or difficult to do two of, like example, the pipeline, you couldn't just do one right next to it. That's something we need to look at. At the same time, we realize that there are incidents that are coming out today that are based on vulnerabilities and bugs and hiccups that have been out in the wild as to be fixed for over 2 years. And so when you have a problem of the intersection of people not patching things and points of failure that are known to not patch things, you have situations like we had this week. The water situation in Florida recently, critical infrastructure is definitely on watch. The one thing I will say, especially with the headline that Brandon selected, when we look at the FBI statistics, nobody's paying $5 million to get out of ransomware. That's a new number. It's a high number. That is going to create a criminal economy red flag that others are going to try and follow suit on. And so when we look at that, that's going to cause others to fall into that. And so just like with the what that Brandon teed up, I have the who, and I will definitely defer to Carrie on this in just a second for the aspects of how these folks operate. But we're looking at ransomware as a service. We're looking at a group that allows others to take their software and to point it like a cannon online and fire at whoever they want. So it's just a matter of the same way you would order a book from Amazon, you can now order ransomware over the dark web. Yeah. And so we have this problem, and it's terrible.
I mean, that's a good point. I mean, these are pirates, right? These are mercenaries, and that's a really dangerous situation where we've got people that are talented like this, that can be essentially that can be taken by any government, any power, anyone with money, and pointed to a target. I mean, Carrie, one of the things that I was thinking as soon as this happened is, are there Russian intelligence links, right? And knowing what you know about that environment, do you think that there's any way that there are not Russian intelligence links on this one?
No, I mean, yeah. So that's definitely from my background, from a counterintelligence standpoint. This, I mean, let's just look at the timing of this, right? So this is roughly, I think, 1 month after the Biden administration enacted the sanctions and other punishments against Russia for SolarWinds. Which, Matt, I know you have a lot of background and knowledge on that you probably can't share. Some of it maybe you can. But, of course, Russia completely denied involvement. It's typical what we would expect. But if you ask me, based on my background experience, I firmly believe that at a minimum, the Kremlin tacitly approved this campaign. And I think much more likely, they probably orchestrated it. So that really, I think, just the timing here, the state of affairs between the United States and Russia right now. There's definitely involvement, and this is definitely sanctioned. Matt, you talked about the $5 million ransom. I think for me, right, in terms of just thinking about, what a different scenario could look like and hopefully will look like. If Colonial had invested that $5 million in actually hardening, right, their systems, and, the impact of that would have created a vastly enhanced protection posture, not just against this attack vector, but against many other attack vectors, which I hate to say are probably already in some, pre-stage planning activity, right? So that's really what I think is just incredibly unfortunate, but hopefully, the companies that run our critical infrastructure will see this and will finally get very serious about making that type of an investment. DarkSide is a ransomware group. FBI considers them a criminal organization, specifically, cyber criminals. It's interesting, they did acknowledge this shutdown, it appears, in the dark web, but when you're dealing with these types of cyber criminal organizations, the media attention is actually not good for them. So now it appears that they're trying to distance themselves from the actual, taking responsibility for the attack. I did a little bit of digging on DarkSide just because from my background, I'm just always very curious about, what these organizations are, how they're evolving, and where they're now focusing, how they're adjusting their what we call TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. And it appears that this is a pretty new group, but it is actually run by some very known actors that we have been tracking for a long time as a U.S. federal government. And they've been in operation, it looks like, since August of last year. And they've been targeting U.S. and European companies and attempting to extort them, through very common techniques and procedures, such as threatening to leak personal information. And then, they actually, what's funny about it's very Robin Hood, they actually claim to give part of their revenue, essentially their profits, to charity. They say they give it to charity. So I thought that was actually quite laughable.
I hope they give it to the folks that had to pay 30% premiums this week, or 20, maybe 15% premiums this week on gas, right? I mean,
yeah, exactly.
I mean, if I were still in my 20s and, early in my career and had to pay 20 cents more at the pump, that would have killed me back then, right?
No. It's funny though, Brandon, they're actually so organized. They have a press room, a mailing list, and a hotline for their victims to call. And as Matt mentioned, the ransomware as a service model, right, where the hackers can literally develop and share the ransomware attack, and basically they offer those tools up for anybody wishing to carry out an attack. So it is a very organized operation.
Yeah, they make it point and click. They've got tech support people around the clock. They're ready to. They are there. It's a fully functioning business. It just so happens to be criminal business.
I had no idea that it was that robust. Carrie, but one point you mentioned that I just wanted to touch on is that, like when coincidences are unbelievable, they're not coincidences, right? And so this talk track that this hack was meant to only disrupt the business operations, and they didn't know that they would take down a critical piece of infrastructure in, locking up information and essentially putting malware into the infrastructure at this company. Doesn't that feel like so absurd that it has to be attached to someone trying to take down critical infrastructure?
It's absolutely absurd. This is a campaign. This is a very deliberate state-sponsored campaign, as much as the China campaign against our IP and IP theft. Right. This is a very deliberate, well-orchestrated, well-planned, and intentional campaign attacking our United States critical infrastructure.
Yeah,
absolutely. And the trend line is there. I could go into a whole hour-long discussion on the trend line, but it's very clear, and it's public. It's not anything that I'm saying specifically from my background and fighting the foreign intelligence threat from Russia and China. This is very, if you zoom out and you look at the trend line, it's clear and it's compelling.
Well, and the one thing I would say is that, at least with the executive orders that are coming out, we're trying to force as a government, some better behavior on critical infrastructure and government investment. So if the government's spending money on it, at least make sure it's cyber secure or has cyber secure practices. Part of the challenge with Colonial is we don't know truly how they got in yet, but the experts are guessing that it's likely through a spear phishing attempt. And so that's just as much the people being trained as it is, but you still have to have that virus work on the inside. And that's where those vulnerabilities and people who follow just baseline hygiene. And that's where we look at like the way people are getting reviewed for their cybersecurity and their cyber audits matters, because if you don't have your cyber audits up to snuff, then ransomware will have this effect on you.
Yeah.
Matt, how far of a stretch is that? And what's the biggest barrier? Is it cultural? Is it financial? What from your perspective and experience is the biggest barrier to, for these companies to actually move forward and make that investment and prioritize this? And will this attack move the needle in some compelling way?
Well, the biggest challenge you have right now is actually modernization. Cybersecurity tools are technically cheaper than replacing equipment. And as aging equipment comes along, cybersecurity tools just don't work as well. So you actually almost need a 10-to-1 investment from cybersecurity to actual infrastructure. So it's a challenge of getting people to upgrade the whole network on a regular cadence to maintain the ability to really get cybersecurity tools to work with it. I mean, if you've got a very old computer, it's going to be hard to get the most recent vulnerabilities mapped to it. So that's part of the conditionality of this whole thing.
I bet you Colonial had up-to-date audits and up-to-snuff cybersecurity. I mean, that's what, I mean, these energy companies, they invest in every energy project, huge sums of money into cybersecurity. I think, the issue that you're mentioning is the exact right issue. It's actually that the underlying equipment, underlying software, you quite literally can't get it up truly to snuff, right? You have to you've got a burden of CVEs on old software, old systems, old hardware that it's almost impossible to get to a great place with cybersecurity posture alone. You've really got to invest in modernization.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point in terms of with the federal response and engagement on this. I've said this often to the defense industrial base. The companies that comprise the defense industrial base. No single company or the totality of them will ever be able to withstand a state-sponsored attack, cyber attack, right? Russians are the best in the world. So, do we treat them like they're a victim, and, not penalize them and not shame them? How do we sort of get to a point where they're not disincentivized to report these things early as possible, and they're not, they don't hide them and try to deal with these issues on their own and then pay $5 million ransoms? What's that behavior change and then associated incentive structure that the government can actually help drive so that the next one, and there will be another one, is just, mitigated, and the response is much more of a partnership, Matt, I guess I'd look to you for that.
Yeah, the assumption is everybody's going to get popped. The question is, how fast do you spot it and how fast can you mitigate it? The newer your equipment, the better your tools, the faster you can spot it, the faster you can mitigate it. Architecture matters, separating essential systems from non-essential systems. It's all one part of all of this moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, also, this is a great time to bring up the EO, right? So the president's new executive order on cybersecurity, I think the name is Executive Order on Improving the Nation's Cybersecurity. So well-timed, well-named, is it's taking steps to do exactly what is needed, I think, to improve cyber posture, at least within our critical infrastructure, right? We have some markets where, I don't know how we get them out of the Wild West and into a place where it's sort of protecting the average Joe, but at least on our critical infrastructure, we know that executive order is taking us steps closer to better management of cyber risk. I think one of the things you said, Carrie, is, we've got a coordinated offense. And when you've got a uncoordinated defense, right, or a lack of offense yourself, you're going to get caught. And so one of the things that I zoomed in on and saw and loved about this executive order right from the jump was Section 2, where they make clear, it's just a little bit up, Cody. Section 2 is right at the top, right under policy. Where they make clear, and I hope that this is intentional, that it's this forward facing, that they want to remove the barriers to sharing threat information, right? That's a critical first step to aligning the information and the intelligence that everyone has access to. And it also allows us to start looking at that next step of sharing that information with industry, so that we've got indicators of compromise coming in, we've got indicators of compromise going out, and we can sort of build this, trusted network of information sharing that allows us to spot these issues. Because, Matt, I bet you the top defense contractors, in fact, I know the top defense contractors are fielding, thousands of these things a week. Imagine if we could get that out to a group of like trusted small businesses and medium-sized businesses in the United States, tell them where they saw the attacks and what those attacks were, right? And how and what their defenses are. That kind of information, moves the ball forward in a way that we haven't previously seen. So I love this part around threat and information sharing, but I also like that the EO overall is focused on transparency, right? Because light is the best disinfectant, right? If we can have transparent software supply chains, transparent CVEs, transparent software provenance, it is it's going to make it so that we can see where problems can crop up and really help.
Yeah,
Carrie,
and the big, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Carrie, any thoughts on this sort of the frame?
Yeah, no, and I think Matt will have thoughts too. That is a core mission of DHS, is to enable that information sharing with the private sector on threats and vulnerabilities. So Matt may have more to say there. I'll just say that is always a lovely thing to see. I've seen it in countless executive orders and countless legislative provisions. It's just one of the most complicated things on the execution side that you can identify. I mean, it really is a challenge. Even within the federal government, we still struggle, right? We started actually in earnest focusing on threat information sharing really after 9/11, right? I'd say that's where we doubled down and realized, holy cow, if we don't start to act like a single, whole of government on Team USA, bad things happen, right? If we operate in stovepipes and silos and we don't share threat information, we are a long ways past 9/11 and we still struggle. Definitely has gotten better. The intelligence community operates, on a single cloud environment, and it's improved to some degree, but it is not in any way, and I think Matt would agree, where it needs to be. A lot of it is complicated. A lot of it has to do with the authorities under which you collect certain threat information. And there are limitations based on those authorities that are unique to every agency. And sometimes in the case of DoD and DHS, every single, individual component has different authorities. And so they can't even share within their own department. I always like to see that language too. I can tell you it's the actual execution implementation of that is one of the most complicated things I think you could talk about. So, but Matt, I mean, in particular, the public-private information sharing, you can probably speak to that a little bit more than I can.
Yeah, this comes right off the heels of SolarWinds, where you had Microsoft that was only allowed to speak to the government clients that it actually serviced in its relationship, and it couldn't speak, like, for example, if CISA was a client of Microsoft and it had this incident, CISA in their official government role couldn't talk to Microsoft about any other agency. You could only talk about CISA because that was the way the contract read. And so they had to go through the other agencies to operate with Microsoft to get that information the way they needed to go. And it was just a legal framework they had to operate under. And so it's that kind of challenges there. But also from a transparency standpoint, you have the opening up of source code and things. And most companies are doing this already with the government, but this is a push to get more. So when Microsoft said their source code was likely compromised, that's because they gave it to the government to review, and the government had it on its servers. And when they hacked the government, they got the source code.
Can you believe, I mean, if someone told me 10 years ago that the federal government and industry would say, hey, we're really concerned about security, you've got to move to the cloud, I never would have believed you. I mean, that point in and of itself is so interesting, right? Like, kudos to companies like AWS that have, taken a lead in creating secure processing environments. But 10 years ago, everybody was saying the only way to be secure is to hold that data yourself. It's on-prem, it's on-prem, it's on-prem. Now everyone's like, I don't want that liability anymore. Put it in the cloud, zero trust. It's totally safe. It strikes me, it hits me. It's so funny.
It is. So we could go on, I think, for a very long time. And that's why I'm very excited about being able to do this again, hopefully next week. I'm sure there'll be something, either extension of what we talked about today or something brand new, who knows, but
it depends if anyone actually watches this, right, Cody? We'll see.
I'm not worried about that. I just learned a ton, and I know that our audience will as well, but I'm curious to know, anyone who's watching at this point, I'd love to hear what you want to talk about, what topics interest you, and where we can add a little bit of insight. As you can see, I think you all have such interesting backgrounds and sort of angles that you bring to the conversation. And I will also be sending it to my friends and family when they start asking me questions I can't answer, but they're seeing the news. So thanks for doing this, everyone. I hope everyone has a great weekend, and more to come.
Thanks, Cody. See ya.